Well, howdy everyone, my name's Chris and today I'm reviewing a lens that's been popular for a long time, the venerable Canon 17-40mm f4 USM L. It's been a stalwart of the Canon lens lineup for a long time and it's primarily designed to be an ultra-wide-angle lens for full-frame cameras, so I'm going to test it on a full-frame Canon 6D. However, the lens can also work as a general-purpose zoom lens on Canon's less expensive APS-C cameras, like the 70D, the Rebel series, anything that costs under £1,000. So I'll talk more about that later, and also give you some APS-C test results. Now, I got this footage on a full-frame camera. Most zoom lenses on full-frame start at 24mm, which you can see here. Well, this lens can zoom all the way out to 17mm, giving you very wide coverage indeed. Ultra-wide-angle lenses give you striking images. They're a lot of fun and also very useful, especially for getting pictures of wide landscapes, architecture, or shooting in big churches or other indoor spaces. But this lens is also notable for its very handy zoom range, going from 17mm all the way to 40mm. This makes the lens pretty versatile, and the maximum aperture of f4, while not exactly letting in tons of light, does at least stay the same as you zoom in, which is a really nice feature, especially for video work. That f4 maximum aperture doesn't make this a fast camera lens. As I said, it doesn't let in loads of light. But if you're using it on a full-frame camera, then that's not the biggest problem in the world, as your camera's high ISO performance should be very good. Just crank up the ISO a little. Let's look at this lens's build quality. This is a Canon L lens, as you can tell by the red ring, which means it has professional build quality. It's one of the more affordable Canon L lenses, but it's still a pleasure to use. It's slightly large and has a good weight to it, a good solid feel without being too heavy. The lens is weather sealed, so it should survive being rained on, as long as you put a filter on the front of it. The zoom ring is very smooth and precise and light to use. This is another positive feature for video work, as you can get lovely smooth zooms. The focus ring is also very smooth and precise, and the lens has full-time manual focusing, so you can turn that ring anytime, even if it's turned to autofocus. The autofocus motor is extremely fast, accurate, and silent in use. So basically, this lens is built wonderfully well and it's a real pleasure to use. Now let's look at the image quality. This may be a Canon L lens, but its design is getting a little old now, so let's see how it does on a tough playground of a new full-frame digital camera, the 20-megapixel Canon 6D. We'll start at 17mm, with the aperture wide open at f4. If we look closely in the middle, we can see that the image is very sharp. I've seen sharper, but it's definitely very good. However, things are quite a bit softer in the corners, and the extreme corners are totally blurry. At f5.6, the situation slightly improves, and again at f8, but even then the corners still aren't very sharp. If we look back in the middle, however, the image is extremely sharp. So at 17mm the lens has good colour and contrast, and it's sharp enough in the middle, but the corners are pretty disappointing, especially for a Canon L lens. If we zoom in a little to 24mm, we can see that at f4, the picture quality is again very nice in the middle of the frame, and the corners are a little soft, but it's not quite as bad as at 17mm. If you stop the lens down to f8, then there's a good improvement, but it's still not razor sharp. However, the middle of the picture is. So there's an improvement when you zoom into 24mm. Finally, let's zoom all the way into 40mm. At f4, the middle of the frame again is very sharp and the corners are just okay. Once again, stopping down to f8 brings an improvement, but excellent sharpness still seems to be elusive. Of course, at f8, the middle of the picture is fantastically sharp. So overall, on a full-frame camera, the good news is that this is a lens with good colours and contrast, it's sharp in the middle, and there's very little chromatic aberration. The bad news is that the corners never reach impressive levels of sharpness, being particularly soft at 17mm, which is where you'll want to use this lens the most. I'd say that the image quality is nice, but below average for a Canon L lens. Well, sharpness isn't everything, and there are other optical issues for the lens to deal with. Let's look at distortion. On a full-frame camera at 17mm, unfortunately, we see alarming levels of barrel distortion. The lines in this picture are meant to be straight, if you can imagine that. A full-frame wide-angle zoom lens was never going to do well on barrel distortion, but this amount is extremely disappointing. If you zoom into 24mm, then it's nearly all gone, and at 40mm, we see some slight pincushion distortion instead. But frankly, it seems that Canon dropped the ball here a little. Moving on, we can see that the quality of the bokeh in the out-of-focus background is quite nicely rendered. If you can get an out-of-focus background with this lens, which isn't easy, then they'll be quite subtle and undisturbing. Finally, the lens has some trouble with vignetting. As you can see on this picture at 17mm, those corners are pretty dark. Stop down to f5.6 and they get a little better. Thankfully, Canon cameras have peripheral illumination, which helps get rid of this, at a cost of lower picture quality in the corners. So overall, on a full-frame camera, there are clearly a few letdowns with this lens. Technically, it fails to impress on a few levels. But having said that, despite all its problems, you can still get plenty of great pictures with it. The middle of the image is always very sharp, and the pictures have lots of contrast and they pop out at you. A few of its optical problems can be fixed in Photoshop, except for the soft corners. And the wonderful build quality of the lens makes you want to forgive its shortcomings. So technically there are problems, but the lens is still very nice to use. So that's how it performs on full-frame cameras. Now, once upon a time, about 8 years ago, digital SLR cameras were still quite a new thing, and lots of people were buying Canon's early APS-C cameras. Most people still do, because they're much less expensive than full-frame. But in the old days, the original 18 to 55mm kit lens, the one before image stabilization, was pretty diabolical in terms of picture quality and build quality. So, professionals started buying the 17 to 40mm f4. Instead of being an ultra-wide-angle lens, on an APS-C digital camera, the 17 to 40 gives you an acceptable standard zoom range. Frankly, it's an old-fashioned approach nowadays to use it on an APS-C camera, because you'd be much better served by an f2.8 17 to 50mm zoom lens with image stabilization, which will let in twice as much light and potentially cost less money. But some people still do it anyway. Let's take a look at this lens's image quality on my 18MP APS-C camera, a Canon 60D. Let's start at 17mm, with the aperture wide open at f4. The picture quality in the middle is a bit soft, with poor contrast levels. On the edges of the window frames, unfortunately, we can see hints of purple fringing. The good news is that, in the corners, there's no further drop in sharpness, but we can see some chromatic aberration in the corners of the window frames. Stopping down to f5.6 brings better sharpness and a lot more contrast, and at f8 we can see some pretty good picture quality, although the chromatic aberration remains visible. If we look back in the middle, we can see that the lens is very sharp and the colours and contrast are a bit punchier now. Still, it's disappointing that you have to stop the lens down to f8 to get good picture quality. I can tell you now that I also tested the lens at 24mm and got more or less the same results. Let's look at the image quality zoomed in all the way to 40mm. With the aperture wide open at f4, again, the picture quality is a bit soft with very poor levels of contrast. When we look in the corners, the image quality becomes even worse. Stopping down to f5.6 yields a slight improvement, and at f8 the corners are just about acceptable, while the middle of the picture looks very sharp. Overall, the 17 to 40mm f4L is a mediocre performer on an APS-C camera. This might surprise some people, as it's a Canon L lens and it performed so much better on full frame. Well, the simple fact is that the pixels on the sensor of an APS-C camera are much smaller and more densely packed together, This makes tougher demands on any camera lens, and the 17-40mm is simply an older lens design. It would probably be fine on an older APS-C camera with only 8 megapixels or so, but for a modern APS-C camera like my Canon 60D, I would recommend not using this lens at all. However, it's still a very pleasurable ultra-wide-angle lens to use on a full-frame camera, very good for video work despite its optical shortcomings, and it has a happy home in many people's camera bags. It's a solid lens if you're using a full-frame camera.